Every time I visit, her eyes say what her lips can't, and pretending gets harder. The first time I stepped into my friend's home in months, I felt that familiar mix of casual comfort and nervous anticipation that always comes with visiting someone you haven't seen in a while. It was late afternoon, the kind of golden light that pours through windows and softens everything it touches, giving the room an almost intimate glow. I barely noticed it at first, too focused on my friend, laughing and catching up over trivial jokes, until my eyes drifted toward the kitchen. There she was, my friend's mom, standing by the counter, effortlessly poised. She had that quiet, commanding presence that made people notice her without trying, a sort of elegance that came from years of confidence and self-assurance. Her hair fell lightly over her shoulders, catching the sunlight, and her sweater clung just enough to hint at the graceful curves of her form. I looked away quickly, telling myself it was nothing, just a fleeting thought, but her gaze found mine. It was brief, a flicker, but enough to make my stomach tighten. There was something in the way she held herself, the slight lift of her brow, that suggested she, too, had noticed me. Noticed more than she should, perhaps, if only in passing. Our eyes met for a heartbeat, just long enough for me to feel the unusual weight of her attention. Then she smiled politely, tilting her head as she poured a cup of tea, but the warmth in her eyes lingered in my mind long after I turned back to my friend. The rest of the visit passed in a blur of conversation and casual laughter, but I kept catching myself stealing glances at her. Sometimes, our hands brushed as she handed me a plate, just lightly, almost imperceptibly, yet I could feel the quiet steadiness of her touch lingering longer than it should. It wasn't inappropriate. It was simple, human, but it carried a strange electricity I wasn't ready to name. Internally, I wrestled with it. She was my friend's mother, a woman of experience and confidence, while I was just starting to figure myself out, navigating early adulthood. The age gap was undeniable, yet there was a strange familiarity in her warmth, a comfort that made the boundaries blur in ways I hadn't expected. I found myself noticing the small things, the faint scent of her perfume, the soft rustle of her sweater as she moved, the gentle cadence of her voice when she spoke to my friend. Each detail drew me in, and yet I forced myself to keep my distance, to act like nothing had shifted between us. By the time I left, the sun was lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the driveway. I shook her hand at the door, but my fingers lingered a moment too long. She looked up at me then, really looked, and I could swear her smile carried a secret she wasn't ready to speak aloud. I walked away with my heart racing, my mind replaying the simplest moments of the afternoon. Every glance, every brush of skin, every unspoken acknowledgement. Something had changed, I realized, something unspoken that neither of us would admit. Yet, that day, I discovered that first glances could carry weight, and subtle tension could speak louder than words ever could. And as I drove away, I knew one thing for certain. Every time I came here, it was going to get harder to pretend that nothing was happening. It didn't take long for my visits to her home to feel different, more charged, more alive than I had ever imagined. Each time I crossed the threshold, a quiet awareness settled over the room, as though the air itself knew we were both treading on dangerous emotional ground. My friend was distracted in his usual ways, laughing at jokes, sprawled lazily on the couch, while I became hyper-aware of the subtleties of her presence. She moved with that same effortless grace I'd noticed the first time, but now I saw more. The way her hand lingered on the counter a moment longer than necessary, the faint brush of her fingertips against mine when handing me a cup of coffee, the soft rustle of her hair as she tucked it behind her ear, all small gestures that seemed innocent but carried an electric undertone. Each one left me acutely conscious of her proximity, a warmth spreading through me that I had no intention of showing aloud. There were moments I could barely describe as mere coincidences. Helping her carry groceries into the kitchen, my hand brushed hers, light, accidental, and yet I felt the subtle pulse of her energy. She looked at me then, for just a moment, a slow, deliberate glance that lingered longer than it should. My pulse quickened, and I quickly looked away, pretending to adjust a bag, though I knew we were both aware of the tension. She gave a faint, knowing smile, but her eyes held something more. Curiosity, perhaps, or a quiet acknowledgement that we were navigating uncharted territory. I noticed how careful we both became. Each movement, each conversation, carried an unspoken weight. I would find her glancing my way when she thought I wasn't looking, catching my subtle reactions with a perceptiveness that made me simultaneously nervous and thrilled. Her laughter sometimes lingered in the air near me, like a soft invitation I wasn't supposed to follow, and I felt a magnetic pull toward her presence that was impossible to ignore. Internal conflict was a constant companion. I reminded myself, she was my friend's mother, a woman with a life and experiences I could never fully understand. Yet, her warmth, her subtle touches, the quiet depth in her eyes, drew me in any way. And I could tell, slowly but unmistakably, that she was aware of it too. She carried herself with composure, yet there were moments, a fleeting sigh, a lingering look, where her restraint faltered. Those moments spoke louder than anything she could say, and I felt them with an intensity that was both thrilling and terrifying. By the time I left that afternoon, my mind was a tangle of emotions. The brush of her hand, the warmth of her gaze, the softness of her smile. It all replayed like a melody I couldn't forget. I walked away with a quiet awareness that every visit would carry more tension, more silent acknowledgement of feelings neither of us dared voice. And somewhere deep inside, I knew that the simple act of being near her had begun to change me in ways I wasn't ready to admit. It was subtle, invisible to everyone else, but between us, the air had shifted. We had begun a delicate dance, one of lingering glances, brief touches, and quiet recognition that neither of us could deny. And somehow, even though nothing had been said aloud, we both knew that pretending was getting harder with every visit. It was one of those ordinary afternoons that, in retrospect, changed everything. I had stopped by my friend's house under the pretense of hanging out, watching a movie, maybe helping with some small chore. The air carried the familiar warmth of home. Sunlight streaming through the windows, the faint smell of baked goods from earlier, and the hum of everyday life that made me almost forget the undercurrent of tension I now felt whenever I came here. Almost, but not entirely. She appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, holding a cup of tea, her presence instantly filling the space. She smiled, polite and serene, but there was something in her eyes that caught me off guard, a weight behind the calm, a softness tinged with hesitation. I felt my chest tighten, a strange pull that I couldn't define. Then, almost too quietly for anyone else to hear, she spoke. "Every time you come over," she said, her voice barely above a murmur, "it gets harder to pretend." The words hit me like a soft, electric jolt. I froze, unsure whether I had imagined them at first. My mind raced. Did she really just say that? Was it meant for me? Did my pulse betray me? Her eyes flicked toward mine for just a second, and I saw it there. The same recognition, the same unspoken admission mirrored in her gaze. The polite composure she normally carried seemed to falter ever so slightly, betraying vulnerability I hadn't seen before. I wanted to respond, to ask what she meant, but my voice caught. Instead, I nodded, managing a faint smile, pretending the moment was casual, though internally, everything was anything but. My pulse throbbed in my ears, my thoughts a whirl of excitement, guilt, and something dangerously like hope. She busied herself with placing the tea on the table, but I could see the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers lingered over the cup as if she were grounding herself against the stir of emotions. For the first time, the attraction I'd been feeling wasn't just subtle or imagined. It had a name, a weight, a reality neither of us could ignore. And yet, the social boundaries loomed large. She was my friend's mother, an older, graceful woman with her own life and dignity. I was young, still figuring out my own world. The mere acknowledgement of what she had just said was enough to ignite a quiet panic, a desperate wish that the world would pause and allow us a private bubble in which to explore these feelings safely. We both retreated slightly, each to our internal reflections. Her eyes softened, offering a silent apology for speaking out loud, while mine darted away, shame and exhilaration mingling in equal measure. It was an intimate moment without touch, a confession without words fully spoken, a delicate, dangerous acknowledgement of something that had been building quietly between us. As I left later that day, her words lingered in my mind like the faint trace of perfume on clothing. Every time you come over, it gets harder to pretend. I replayed the phrase endlessly, feeling the weight of what had been said, what had been revealed, and what we were both trying and failing to suppress. That afternoon, I realized something profound. The slow burn had begun in earnest, and neither of us could go back to pretending ignorance again. By now, my visits to her house carried a rhythm I could no longer ignore. Every gesture, every shared glance, seemed to vibrate with unspoken meaning. What had once felt like casual encounters was becoming a quiet dance of proximity and restrained desire, a slow-burn tension neither of us dared disrupt. That afternoon, I arrived to help her with something small, organizing groceries, rearranging the kitchen after a long day. She moved with the same effortless elegance I'd noticed before, but now I observed the subtle ways she invited closeness without speaking. The way she leaned slightly toward me while lifting a bag, the light touch of her fingertips as she passed me an item, her hand brushing briefly against mine with a softness that lingered in my skin long after the contact ended. There was a moment when we reached for the same jar on the top shelf. Our hands touched, and the brush was electric. She pulled back just enough to maintain propriety, but I could feel the warmth radiating from her, a gentle pressure that made my pulse accelerate. Her eyes met mine, and for the briefest instant, the room seemed to shrink to just the two of us. I felt the quiet steadiness of her gaze, an unspoken acknowledgement that neither of us could completely hide the tension simmering beneath polite conversation. Later, we settled in the living room, tea in hand. The rain had started outside, pattering softly against the windows, providing a gentle soundtrack for the afternoon. She handed me a cup, and our fingers brushed. I held the warmth of the tea in my hands, but I also felt the warmth of her presence beside me, close enough that our knees nearly touched under the table. We didn't speak of the brush of hands, the accidental closeness. It wasn't necessary. The room held its own language, quiet, intimate, charged with awareness. I caught her looking at me from time to time, subtle glances that made me simultaneously nervous and exhilarated. When she laughed at something my friend said, her eyes lingered on me just a fraction too long, as though measuring my reaction. I could feel the pull of her attention, gentle yet impossible to ignore. And though our gestures remained entirely appropriate, there was a sensuality in the restraint, a thrill in the safe spaces we allowed ourselves to inhabit together. The internal struggle was constant. Every time I reached to hand her something, every time we brushed past one another, a small fire sparked within me. Yet I respected her boundaries, aware of the delicate line we were walking. She did the same, letting moments linger just long enough to feel, but never crossing into words or actions that would disrupt the quiet understanding forming between us. By the time I left, the rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean and quiet. I walked to the door, acutely aware of her proximity, the warmth that clung in my memory, the subtle, fleeting touches that had already become moments I couldn't stop replaying. Each visit left me more aware of her presence, more conscious of the tension and connection building silently between us. And I knew, without question, that the slow burn had grown deeper, its heat more undeniable, yet carefully contained in the subtle intimacy of our shared moments. That evening, the house felt quieter than usual. The sun had dipped low, leaving a soft golden glow through the curtains, casting long, warm shadows across the living room. I had come over under the usual pretext of hanging out, but there was something different in the air, a gentle invitation for a more personal connection. She sat on the couch, her posture relaxed but purposeful, as though she had been expecting a conversation that went beyond casual small talk. I joined her, careful to leave a respectful distance, though I could feel the pull of her presence like a quiet tide, tugging at the edges of my awareness. She held a cup of tea in her hands, the steam rising in soft tendrils, curling toward her face, highlighting the subtle lines of experience around her eyes. There was a softness in her gaze that I hadn't noticed before, a vulnerability carefully concealed behind layers of composure. "Sometimes," she began, her voice almost a whisper, "you don't realize how much you miss someone noticing you." Her words hung between us, fragile yet charged. She spoke of loneliness, of moments in her life when she had felt unseen, when the world's expectations had weighed heavily on her shoulders. I listened silently, letting her share without interruption. There was no judgment, no pity, just quiet, unwavering attention. My heart ached at the honesty in her voice, the way her eyes shimmered with unspoken stories. In turn, I found myself sharing small truths about my own insecurities, the parts of my life I rarely voiced. My words came haltingly at first, tentative, but she listened with an intensity that made me feel seen. Every now and then, her fingers brushed lightly against mine, not in a deliberate gesture, but in a way that communicated comfort, empathy, and a quiet, grounding warmth. At one point, she reached across to tuck a stray strand of hair behind my ear, her touch light, but lingering enough to send a small shiver down my spine. Our eyes met then, longer than before, and in that moment, there was no need for words. The room was quiet, the air heavy with the intimacy we had carefully built over countless visits. I could feel the steadiness of her heartbeat, the warmth radiating through her arm as it rested near mine, and I realized just how deeply our connection had grown. We ended that evening with a hug, one that lingered slightly longer than necessary. Her arms slipped around my shoulders with a gentleness that spoke of trust, of mutual understanding. For a heartbeat, I felt the world fall away. The age gap, the social boundaries, all the complications seemed to dissolve in the quiet safety of that embrace. Walking home later, I replayed every moment. The way she had shared her vulnerabilities, the small touches, the silent acknowledgement in her eyes. I felt a quiet certainty that what we had between us was real, a slow-burn connection built on trust, respect, and the courage to reveal our inner selves. It was intoxicating, grounding, and terrifying all at once. That night, I understood something fundamental. Affection wasn't just in words or gestures. It was in a shared vulnerability, the willingness to trust, and the quiet moments that left hearts beating a little faster, even when nothing more than presence was exchanged. Between us, intimacy had taken root, and it was stronger than any words we had yet spoken. The rain had started early that evening, drumming softly against the windows and adding a rhythmic pulse to the quiet house. I hadn't planned to stay long, but the storm made leaving impossible, and neither of us seemed in any hurry to break the spell the weather had cast. We found ourselves sitting close on the sofa, sharing a blanket for warmth. The small space between us felt charged, every inch of proximity carrying a tension that neither of us could ignore. She leaned slightly toward me as she reached for her cup of tea, her arm brushing mine in a touch that lingered longer than necessary. My pulse jumped at the contact, my mind suddenly hyper-aware of every subtle motion. The gentle rise and fall of her shoulders, the soft warmth radiating from her hand, the way her hair occasionally fell across her cheek, just close enough for me to notice the faint scent of her perfume. There was a quiet intimacy in the shared silence, an unspoken understanding that everything in this moment mattered. Her eyes found mine, and I could see the flicker of hesitation, the conflict between desire and propriety. It was mirrored in my own expression, though I tried to mask it with a casual smile. We spoke in small, careful phrases about the storm, about movies, about trivial things, but every word was layered with meaning, every pause weighted with what we weren't saying. It was a delicate dance, an unspoken acknowledgement of attraction, restrained by the awareness of our age gap, of her position in my friend's life, of the world watching even when it wasn't. At one point, she shifted slightly to adjust the blanket over my shoulders. Her hand lingered near mine, brushing against my arm, and I felt a quiet jolt of awareness that ran straight through me. I wanted to reach for her hand, to close the gap just enough to feel the steadiness of her fingers against mine, but I stopped, aware of the consequences of the delicate line we were walking. She gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, her eyes lingering on my face, and for a moment, it felt as if time had slowed, leaving only the two of us suspended in that charged space. We talked hypothetically, then, about love, about longing, about choices that life forces us to make, skirting around the words we both wanted to say but couldn't. The near confession hung in the air like the storm outside. Intense, heavy, impossible to ignore. I could feel her heartbeat in the small space between us, and I knew she could feel mine as well. The rain intensified, a steady percussion that mirrored the rapid rhythm in my chest. I wanted to lean closer, to let my forehead rest against hers, to allow the closeness to speak louder than words ever could. But instead, we remained suspended in tension. Every brush of skin, every shared glance, every careful gesture amplified the awareness that this connection was real, palpable, and dangerous in its intensity. By the time the storm began to soften, the near confession had settled into a quiet understanding between us. We weren't ready to speak it aloud yet, but the truth of our feelings was undeniable. That evening left me with a heightened awareness. Intimacy wasn't only physical. It was in the tension, in the near touch, in the unspoken words that weighed heavier than any confession could. And as I left her home later, the memory of that charged closeness stayed with me, a slow-burning promise that neither of us could ignore. The evening air was cool as I walked to her house, the faint scent of rain still clinging to the streets. I had come over as usual, expecting the ordinary rhythm of friendship, but both of us knew, without words, that the atmosphere had shifted. There was a quiet acknowledgment in her eyes when she greeted me, a softness and warmth that suggested the tension between us had finally settled into something mutual, something that no longer needed to be forced or hidden. Inside, the house was softly lit, the warm glow of lamps casting gentle shadows across familiar furniture. She offered me tea, and our hands brushed as I took the cup. The touch lingered just a fraction longer than necessary, but neither of us pulled away. We settled on the couch, sitting close enough that the edges of our knees touched under the blanket we shared. The proximity was natural now, comfortable, intimate without being overwhelming. We spoke quietly, in measured tones, about trivial things. Movies, her latest gardening triumphs, a book I had been reading. But beneath the conversation was the unspoken understanding of what had grown between us. Every glance, every smile, every small gesture carried weight. When our hands met while reaching for the same item, neither of us recoiled. Instead, we let them rest together briefly, the warmth of her fingers grounding me, reassuring me. When it was time for me to leave, the world outside had turned a deep shade of night. I lingered at the doorway, hesitant, acutely aware of the quiet pull between us. She stepped closer, and for a moment, the distance melted away. Her arms slipped around my shoulders, the warmth of her embrace steady and grounding. I could feel the beat of her heart against mine, the gentle pressure of her head resting near my cheek. It was a hug that lingered longer than it needed to, a wordless acknowledgement of everything we had been feeling, everything we had restrained, and everything that had been building quietly over months of subtle glances, touches, and shared moments. We parted slowly, fingers lingering in a soft brush, eyes meeting in a gaze that spoke louder than any confession could. Neither of us needed to say the words aloud. The honesty of that connection was clear, mutual, and unshakable. I stepped outside, the night air cool against my skin, but I carried the warmth of her presence with me. The faint scent of her perfume seemed to cling to the air, a reminder that our bond was real, undeniable, and enduring. As I walked away, I reflected on everything that had passed. The stolen glances, the fleeting touches, the confessions both whispered and unspoken. The slow burn had reached a natural, satisfying conclusion. We had discovered a connection rooted in trust, respect, and quiet affection. The tension had not disappeared. It had been transformed into something stable, comforting, and infinitely precious. In that moment, I understood that love didn't always have to rush, didn't always have to be declared in grand gestures. Sometimes, it existed in the subtle, human details, a hand brushing against another, a lingering hug, a shared smile and silence. And as I turned the corner and disappeared into the night, I felt a quiet certainty. We had found something rare, a slow-burning intimacy that neither time nor circumstance could diminish. Pretending was no longer necessary. We had found fulfillment in each other, quietly, completely, and beautifully.